Hello, hi, this is Professor JPS, and this is, um, April 5th, 2020. This is a lecture for Communication Arts 101, sections 1 and 2. If you're in section 1, that means you have class on Monday and Wednesdays from 10 to 11:20. And if you're in section 2, that means you have class on Tuesday evenings from 5:30 to 8:25. I've combined this particular lecture for both sessions since section 2, which is normally about a week ahead of section 1. Section 1 has now caught up to section 2, so there's no sense for me to make two different lectures for this particular lecture that has to do with the recording industry, chapter 10 in the textbook. Okay, so this is for both sections. I must continue to insist that for those of you who have not been going to your NCC email addresses, to please get to your NCC email addresses. For section 2, there are still a handful of people who just have not answered me back, and you had a test last week that I sent out on Tuesday with a review from the video and sent out in a mass email to all of the students in section 2 Tuesday evening. And there's still a good 4 or 5 or maybe 6 of you that just have never answered me back. I try to reach you, whatever phone numbers I have for you, I try to reach you. I know that this is a very difficult time, and I know that students are, sometimes they're working a full-time job because of the difficulty of the corona. Sometimes they're taking care of people. But just please get in touch with me. For those of you who haven't gotten in touch with me, just email me. I don't have everybody's personal email account. I just don't have that. All I have are the NCC email accounts. So I must insist that you try your best to link your personal email to your NCC account, okay? If you haven't done that. Or just please check your NCC email accounts, okay? I don't know what else to do. If I can't reach you, I can't reach you, but I'm surprised that people haven't tried to reach me to wonder what's going on, even though I told everyone what was going to be happening and sent out many emails to all the classes. So please, you're not going to be in trouble if there's some COVID related thing. Of course not. But if I don't know, I don't know. So please email me at jshields@norwalk.edu. Okay. Anyway, this particular lecture deals with textbook chapter 10, the recording industry. And I think of all of the chapters that we have in the textbook, this is the chapter I will least refer to particular pages. In fact, the argument that I make for this particular unit, the music unit, the recording industry unit, has less to do with the bells and whistles or the facts and figures of the recording industry, and more to do with what I call a contextual argument about popular music in the United States in the last 100 years or so. So I want to kind of go through this, much of this information is not in the textbook. Much of this information has to do with a kind of an understanding of the power of popular music stemming from a particular contextual idea. Now, I think when you're watching these videos, you should probably hit pause every once in a while and just jot things down in a notebook or get a sense of it. What I'll try to do is repeat as much as possible so I'm not going too fast or boring you too much. Let's just take, for instance, the idea of context, okay? Context is really an important, powerful teaching tool that students should have a sense of. What context means, roughly speaking, for the lack of a better definition, context has to do with the political, social, economic, artistic aspects of any given time period. Political, social, economic, artistic aspects of any given time period. Okay? So you can use this sort of notion or this idea of context to discuss popular culture in any era, right? So, the 30s were a different era than the 50s. The 80s were a different era than the 2000s. The 2010s were a different era than the 1940s. Well, what are the things that make up those decades? What are the things that make up the 30s? The Great Depression and the beginnings of World War II, or the 60s were filled with radical different kinds of changes, the Vietnam War movement and the Civil Rights movement and so forth. Politics and economics and social movements, they all intertwine, they all affect whatever is happening in the then present time. So when we look back on areas of popular culture, for instance, this particular unit, we're looking back at music, popular music. We have to treat the era of popular music with a contextual argument, with an argument that makes sense from the perspective of social, economic, political realities that affected how music was distributed and how music was absorbed. Okay? And in this particular unit, what I want to discuss is the experience of the African American community on this continent and in this country, and how African American experience and their relationship with music was indeed very powerful and unbelievably influential in the formation of American music, American popular music. Okay? So what I'm trying to get at with this particular unit has less to do with what's in the textbook in terms of some of the facts and figures, and more to do with a kind of broad palette, a broad stroke of context about how the difficulties of being African American on this continent, in this country historically, how that fomented in the African American community an interest and power with music, and how that interest and power in music became really steadily influential in American music in the larger context. Okay? So I know that I'm just about the most Caucasian person in the world describing this idea, but I've always been interested in the idea of how it is that certain groups have developed and redeveloped interest and power in areas of popular culture. And I think that the African American experience and its relationship to music is a very, very powerful one, and not looked at very often by white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever. It's American, but it's primarily African American in terms of its sense of authenticity and power. So just to briefly recap where we started, right? I'm less worried about what's in the textbook for this particular chapter. I'm more interested in discussing context, and more specifically the context of the African American experience and how music in the African American community worked as almost a kind of survival mechanism, a tool, and allowed for African Americans to become really very, very influential in terms of music. Now, think about, historically speaking, on this continent, in this country, the African American experience. There are two big, somewhat powerful and negative aspects to that. One is slavery. Slavery, right? Now, in this country, we learn about slavery in like 4th or 5th grade social studies class. And if we're black or white or Hispanic or Asian or whatever we are, we learn it as a kind of fact. We learn about the Civil War. We learn about Abraham Lincoln. And we learn that, of course, slavery was terribly, terribly wrong, and it existed for 400 and some years. But when we're 10, 12 years old, I don't know that we absorb it well enough, other than what we're going to get on our social studies test in Miss McGillicuddy's class in 5th or 6th grade or something. If you stop and think about what slavery is, just how horrific it is, and how it was a tradition on this continent, even before we had a country, that human beings were owned by other human beings. And those human beings that were owned had absolutely no rights on this earth. They were born into slavery and they died in slavery. That's almost incomprehensible to understand that, to think about what that means. That you have absolutely no rights, you have absolutely no freedoms whatsoever, and that you toil in hot sun all day long and receive nothing for your work. And even if you're sort of married off to someone, it's not a legal marriage. And the offspring that you get from that marriage, the children you make from that marriage, are not your own. They're bought and sold as they grow. And then you die without any sense of a life that had any meaning other than the labor that it produced for the people who owned you. And if you think about it just for a moment and put yourself in that position, it's incomprehensible. I mean, we're mad when we don't get cell service. Do you know what I mean? Could you imagine having to live a life like that? You weren't allowed to read or write. You weren't allowed to learn, because if you learned, maybe you could think, and if you thought, maybe you'd revolt. You weren't allowed to have any traditions back to your native Africa. You weren't allowed to have anything that sends your own identity. There was no linearity between you and your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. They were sold from you. You were simply a tool of labor to make money for the people who owned you. And it really wasn't that long ago, if you think about it in terms of the leaps of history. It's 100 and some years ago, 150 years ago. The one thing that slaves were afforded, were allowed to do, were allowed to have, was to sing. And in fact, there's a kind of a cruel irony that the masters would let them sing their rather sad songs about the plight that they had, almost amused at how well African Americans would sing about their plight, and to some degree dance, and to some degree what was called something called the oral tradition, which they would pass down stories as best they could to other African Americans to let people know that they were here and that they were suffering this horrible, horrible thing called slavery. So if you're a person who's a slave and you have nothing other than the labor and toil that you have to do for someone else, and the only way that you're even allowed to better yourself or express yourself is to sing, then singing and music becomes a very important component to your own identity, right? Now, this is somewhat broad and simple-minded in terms of the ideas of how music becomes powerful to the African American community. But with slavery comes nothing other than the horror for African Americans. They're owned by other people. But the one sliver that they're allowed to do, allowed to have, allowed to think through and feel and express was music. Okay? Now, slavery ends in 1864. The Civil War, or 1865, and after the rest of the 1800s, and really until the 1960s, is what number two in our contextual idea has to do with the notion of institutional racism. And by institutional racism, I mean everyday racism that African Americans had to put up with really until the mid-1960s, which isn't that long ago at all. And what institutional racism means is the inability of the African American community to actually take their place in American society freely because of segregation and because of the inability of the white power to allow for African Americans to actually utilize the institutions of American life. So if you're an African American after the Civil War, yeah, you're no longer a slave, but you still don't have access to institutions like white people do. You're not allowed to live in certain sections of certain areas. You're not allowed to go to school with white people. You're not allowed to ride a bus with white people. You're not allowed to cross over into white communities much at all, other than working as a maid or a butler or something like that. And this happens from 1865 to 1965, roughly speaking. Even some powerful, wonderful, smart, elegant, terrific African Americans in the intellectual world, in the music world, in the sports world, in the artistic world, they're segregated. They're not allowed to rent apartments in certain sections of New York City. They're not allowed to rent or go to school with white children. Not just in the South, in most of America, right? I mean, you've heard the term black neighborhood, right? What do you think? All black people like each other and they just stay in their same neighborhood? No, they were disallowed by the institutions of American life to make their own claims into neighborhoods by real estate people, by lawyers, by bankers, by people who would lend money to buy homes. It was a kind of what's called institutional racism. They weren't allowed to live side by side. It was kind of a second-class citizenship, right? Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900 to say like 1945, you really have 4 different kinds of musical categories that allow for African Americans to express their frustration, express their feelings, express their disillusion with the American system even after slavery. And 2 of these are somewhat religious, and 2 of these are not religious, or what you might call secular. So the 2 that are religious are called spiritual music, and gospel music. Okay? Very, very important to the African American community, primarily the Christian church, various Christian churches, Baptist, Presbyterian, what have you. But the African American community is very, very powerful in its utilization of music in both spiritual songs and gospel songs. Because at the beginning of the 19th century, if life on this planet and on this country is very, very hard, to have a faith in a God and a faith in an everlasting life in heaven is a very important component to the African American community, like it is in other communities in terms of the idea of religion. But the expression that African Americans utilized in church was powerful and meaningful and downright good and authentic, right? And the other 2 kinds of music are the opposite, but still primarily African American. And those are rhythm and blues and jazz. Okay? So roughly speaking, again, I'm painting in very broad strokes here, but roughly speaking, between 1900 and say 1950, African Americans have some more freedom, certainly than they did from the century before, but still are suffering from institutional racism. And music becomes a very important component to the African American community and the African American identity, because music is the one thing that African Americans were, quote unquote, allowed to do. And even white power brokers saw the authenticity and power of the African American music because it comes from a place of pain, because it comes from a place of legitimacy, right? I think perhaps you would understand this from the sort of rap perspective some 70 years later, when people would say someone was keeping it real, I suppose. I know that sounds terribly corny coming from my stupid mouth, but do you know what I mean? In other words, if the only thing you have is music, then music becomes a very, very important component to one's own identity. Similarly to the idea of in terms of Judaism, right? Judaism, there's so many comedians who are Jewish because after centuries of anti-Semitism, there's a kind of dark humor that Jews deployed to get themselves through 5,000 years of anti-Semitism. Or the Irish community, they have a very, very sad sense of mortality, and the Irish are in love with the idea of death. And Irish poets are always talking about the diminishment of Irish life under the thumbnail of the British and writing about death all the time. And pick your particular ethnicity, there's always some connection to art in one form or another. I'm no expert on world ethnicities and their artistic expressions, but I think it's safe to say the African American community has been in American tradition related to music in terms of its big expression, among others, but music is very, 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 very important. So with rhythm and blues and jazz, it's in some ways the opposite side of the coin to the religious sensibility. The religious sensibility is very, very powerful. To this day, it's still very powerful for the African American community. But the other side has to do with blues, has to do with the feeling of difficulty, and jazz, which is just American classical music performed to be listened to and to some degree danced to, that has less to do with God or Jesus or heaven or that kind of stuff, and more to do with the power of listen to music. In fact, jazz music is probably the most important American music. It will last centuries from now, because jazz music is composed. It's composed music to be listened to. It's American classical music. Okay, but that's neither here nor there. So when you have these four kinds of music that is kind of the bedrock in the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900 to 1950, it's important to understand that they're not mutually exclusive. By that I mean that just because you may be somebody who's religious does not mean you're not interested in jazz. Or just because you may be singing the blues by some riverbank in the Delta does not mean that you didn't enjoy spiritual music as a younger person. In other words, two of them are religious and two of them are secular or non-religious, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have some cross-pollination, right? I mean, to this day, if you ask like some of your hardcore rappers, they'll say, yeah, I got my start singing in church with my grandmother, and I understood the community and I understood the feeling of spiritual and gospel music was powerful, but then I still lived in a tough neighborhood and people sold drugs and I ended up being a rapper, right? Similarly to jazz musicians in the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, they were interested in spiritual music as well, but they used some here and some there and they kind of cross-pollinated, okay? The point is, the reason African American music was and is still so influential is because it comes from a place of authenticity. It comes from a place of pain. It comes from a place of an expression that's validated in a kind of real way, rather than a kind of just superficial, commercial, sellout kind of way, okay? So in the beginning of the 20th century, 1900 to 1950, let's say, African American musicians did not become big stars, generally speaking, because they didn't have access to the American marketplace the way white musicians did. They couldn't play the ballrooms or get on radio, or they couldn't become national stars. Now, occasionally some would get through, and white musicians would champion them as much as they could. But what started to happen was white musicians, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way, would start to kind of borrow and steal and take the African American feeling and then sell that through a white musician, covering, appropriating that kind of music. It happened as far back as jazz, and it certainly happens in rock and roll in the 1950s. But this contextual argument I'm trying to make is that African Americans on this continent, in this country, had such a difficulty in terms of slavery and institutional racism, and that by default, music became a kind of surviving mechanism, a surviving tool, because it was the one thing that was allowed back in slave times, and it was the one thing, among other things, that in later times, African Americans really did a good job at, because it came from a place of pain, a place of authenticity. And whether that music was jazz or rhythm and blues or spiritual or gospel, it was important because it was kind of a blueprint, a framework for even music done today. And this happens, I think, most clearly with the development of rock and roll in the 1950s. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are that familiar with the development of rock and roll in the 1950s, but rock and roll in the 1950s was sort of jarring for audiences. And rock and roll is a kind of combination of country and Western music with rhythm and blues music. I'm not so sure how many people realize this in terms of its origins. Rock and roll is really a kind of shotgun marriage, if you like, between country western music and rhythm and blues music. Okay? Now let's sketch out what I mean by that a little more. Country and western music traditionally is white, rural, slower paced, and southern for the most part. Okay? White, rural, that is to say, like out in non-cities, slower paced, and what you might call, what is it? Hurry up, what is it? Oh, you don't? Okay. White, rural, slower paced, and southern. Whereas African American community music is, generally speaking, northern, faster paced, urban, and black primarily. Okay. Around the mid to late 40s, what started to happen was that DJs and some music producers, they started to understand that African American music was more powerful, more dynamic, more sexier, if you like, faster, syncopated, truer somehow to the emerging teenage baby boom market. And what they started to do was started to make country western music sound more like rhythm and blues music, not the other way around. Okay? It was the white people who started to cultivate the African American feeling in their music, the African American sensibility in their music, the African American power in their music, and cultivate that for a white musician or white star. And the best example of this is Elvis Presley. Now, I don't know how many of you know too much about Elvis Presley, but Elvis Presley was, his career took off like a rocket in the mid 50s. Elvis Presley was white, obviously. He was poor. He was a poor white boy from East Tupelo, Mississippi. He was driving a truck. And when he was able to become, he drove into the Sun Record Studios in Memphis. And he was someone who right away knew that if he was going to sing songs, he had to sing them more like the African American sensibility than the country and western sensibility, because he'd found that it was just deeper and more powerful and more moving and sensualized too, I think. And Presley made a record in the early 50s that did very, very well, but he was singing much more like an African American singer would than a white country and western singer would. So rock and roll, really in the person of Elvis Presley, was born of this kind of, because this marriage between white and black, so to speak. I say marriage, I mean, connection between white and black. But Presley was much more sounding like a black guy than he was a white guy. And in fact, when some white racists in the South found out that he was not black, they started to buy his records to burn them because they didn't like the idea that he sounded like a black guy. But that didn't last very long because Elvis Presley became enormously successful right away. But rock and roll's sort of sensibility was much more African Americanized than it was country and westernized. Okay? And that idea of the African American sensibility as filtered through the white musician has happened ever since. And white audiences don't quite recognize it. But if you look at somebody like the Rolling Stones in the 60s, the Rolling Stones are just playing blues. That's all they're doing. They're playing blues music to a white audience. Now, the Rolling Stones are certainly, a great band and had been a great band for many, many years. But they'll be the first to tell you is that they're just pretending to be a black. I mean, Keith Richards, he lives up in Weston. He'll tell you, I'm just pretending to be a black guy because they're cool. And then, somebody like Led Zeppelin. I mean, Led Zeppelin songs are just speeded up blues songs. I mean, that's really all they are. I mean, in fact, they do a song called "A Whole Lot of Love" that's literally an old African American tune by a guy who, I forget who his name was, but he would sit in this poor Delta riverbank and sing a song called "I Got a Whole Lot of Love," and then Led Zeppelin just made it faster and made it like heavy metal. But and even someone like Eminem, who was this national superstar, just a blazing superstar in the early 2000s. Again, I've got nothing against or for Eminem, but it seems to me that Eminem would not have been as giant a star had he been black, and that white audiences have had their white representative of black music given to them every teenage every generation of teenagers has seemingly had that kind of connection. Now, your generation, it's much you're much less worried about the idea of race and what race means, but it's also important that you understand that the African American community's sensibility about music is very, very powerful and influential. And if you look carefully at Presley or Stones or Zeppelin or Eminem, you can see that these particular characters are really, some would say, stealing black music. Others would say appropriating black music. Others would say championing black music. And they're all good artists. But clearly, it's not that black musicians are trying to sound white. It's that white musicians are trying to sound much more black. And that's the point I'm trying to get to. And it's a connectivity all the way back to slavery to your latest rap singer who's influencing audiences still. Okay? Because it comes from a place of pain and authenticity. The expression, the musical expression is real. It's powerful. It's sad. It's joyous. It's interesting. It's sensualized. It's faster, generally speaking. Not that country music isn't valuable, not that other kinds of music that has little to do with race isn't valuable. But what I'm saying is the African American experience contextually was real. It was vibrant. It was powerful. And it's been the backbone of the American popular music scene ever since, because it comes from that place of authenticity. Okay? So that's just a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the African American community and its relationship to American popular music. That is to say, American popular music, whether it knows it or not, is identifiably black, even if it's a white musician, right? Often, what's being transferred is the feeling of African American music and its power, okay? And I imagine most of your generation, your favorite stars are African American and rap musicians, generally speaking, okay? Not to say that white musicians aren't any good, or that idea. That's not what I mean. I'm trying to make a contextual argument. Okay. I also want to discuss music television. Just a couple of things about music television, which I don't even. I mean, you guys watch. I imagine you watch YouTube all the time in terms of getting your music or thinking about your music or learning about new music and new bands or whatever. But just a word or two about MTV and its influence on music in the 80s through the 2000s. MTV started in August of 1981. MTV is nothing more than a commercial vehicle. That is to say, everything on MTV, particularly the first 15 years or so, was just to market musicians. Okay, wholly commercial enterprise. Prior to music television, you would learn about popular music on the radio, and you would listen to music on the radio. Then you would buy records, and you would go see musicians in concert. What music television did is it was a consistent 24/7 commercial marketing machine that put pictures to songs. And because it did that, it sort of put a idea about what a song meant into the imaginations of all the viewers, and kind of made music, popular music, a visual enterprise for 15 or 20 years. It made it something that audiences came to see rather than listen to, right? Now, of course, they would see a video, maybe then buy the record or later CD or what have you, right? And then listen to it. But what MTV started to do was it started to kind of change who became a popular musician because of what it is audiences saw on MTV rather than what audiences listened to on the radio. So it kind of altered the idea of listening to music as opposed to watching it. Like someone like Madonna became a huge superstar in the 1980s, primarily not for her singing or song strength. I mean, she can sing okay, but she's not an outstanding singer. But she was a very clever marketer, and her videos were constantly being shown on MTV. And they put as much work into her videos as it did into her music. So she became somebody who was popular mainly because of her changing persona in videos very frequently. Sometimes they were over-sexual, sometimes they were just somewhat controversial, sometimes they were funny remakes of old movies. She was a kind of pop star, but it was her visual persona much more than her musical chops that made her a star. And then that altered, they had a lot of boy bands and Britney Spears and people who were like seen well on TV rather than people who were talented singers. So it kind of, in my view, both as a citizen and someone interested in popular culture, it diminished music because it became a visual thing rather than an oral thing, something you listened to or you thought about or felt, They took the imagination away and gave meaning to songs that we weren't sure were there. MTV these days is not the same as it was 15 or 20 years ago, but just a note about the idea of MTV visualizing music rather than making music better. In some ways, it made it more like film rather than music. Okay. The other thing I'd like to discuss is the change in music with digital technology. The digital revolution in the 90s and into the 2000s really kind of scared the record labels because the record labels for years had a product that worked. And then with digital music, young people who are always the ones that will make something valuable or interesting in terms of the music industry, the ones who were buying, they started to not buy anymore. They started to download and steal music with MP3s first and then streaming. And then the music industry was quite scared in the 90s because their business model became totally overthrown. Your generation, you've already lived through that. You've already downloaded and do streaming and also use Spotify and so forth. So the music industry was really worried that they weren't going to stay in business. They had to really adapt to streaming and to downloading, which they have done to some degree. And they also make money in different ways than previously in terms of ringtones and other subscription services. That is to say, the record industry. Musicians, in some ways, have more freedom because they can put anything they want up on YouTube. But at the same time, when everyone's doing that, then they don't rise to the top as easy as they used to. In terms of the textbook on page 293 and 294, the digital download revolution is mentioned on 293 and 294. And in terms of some of the other things in the textbook I'd like you to look for, or page 274 and 275. That's just a timeline. Again, these timelines at the beginning of each chapter, you don't have to memorize them. Don't freak out. Just look them over. Just get a sense of them. Just scan them. get a sense of what the textbook author is trying to get at in terms of his historical analysis of music. And also in the textbook, page 279 gives a broad outlook of the more successful record labels, even in the time of digital music. I think Universal is the one you should look at most carefully. Okay. Now, normally with this particular unit, I would chat with you guys about your favorite musicians. Do you play music yourself? Are you interested in singing or dancing? I've had students who are opera singers. I've had students who are rap people who have gotten some record contracts. I've had students tell me that they used to play the violin in elementary school. Normally, we would talk about this. We would talk about our own experiences with music. We'd talk about what music mattered to us. And sometimes I would even play music, jazz music, to you to get a sense of whether you think it was African-American music or whether you think it was white music, to get at this idea of how race plays its way in music. We can't do that. You have to listen to my nasal tone Philadelphia accent and my fat face here in close-up with my stupid sweater on here in my rec room. But do try to get a sense of that idea of the context of African-American experience in this culture, in this country, and how that repression of expression really fomented a kind of musical revolution with African-American pain and legitimacy. Also, email me with questions, okay? Just please try to stay in touch. I know this is not the best way education's working, but I am giving the lectures. These are lectures I would give. I'm trying to give them a little slower so you can write things down. The information is there. I know it's not the best way to do it, but it does take some getting used to disciplining yourself in your own home when you're used to using the computer in your own home for fun, for Instagram, for video games, for Facebook or whatever. So it will take some discipline. But I don't think that you'll see any surprises, both for the MassComm 101 class and the MassComm 101 class section 2, in terms of where we go from here. We're going to go from here to a final exam. And the final is not cumulative other than one question. So the information I'm giving you is available. Please email me if you have questions, okay? The point is you have to stay in touch as much as possible. Now, I know that these are uncertain times. They really are. The numbers have really skyrocketed in Norwalk and elsewhere in Fairfield County. Please take it seriously. Please. Do not go hanging out with your friends. You can't do that right now. You have to stay home as much as possible. I've had a handful of students who have tested positive. My hearts and prayers go out to all of them and their family. So far, so good with all of them, from what I understand. But this is real. This is a real thing that will, hopefully we'll never have to live through something like this again. So if you are going to the store to grab whatever, milk, butter, eggs, or whatever, make sure that you are washing your hands immediately upon getting home. Make sure that you're wiping down stuff that comes in the mail, just briefly. Making sure that if you have hand sanitizer, use it sparingly, but use it. Wipe it on your hands, wipe it on your steering wheel, wipe it on your gear shift, wipe it on your keys, right? It doesn't take much, okay? Your door handles, right? Just be disciplined. It's hard. It really is hard. But if you are healthy, you have to stay healthy. You really, really do, because this is really, really difficult time, okay? So that's it for the music chapter. Read the pages I mentioned in chapter 10. There's not that many of them. 274, 275, 279, 293, 294. And just the key idea has to do with the African-American community and its relationship to music in this century, or on this continent, in this country, and how powerful it is, okay? So this is for ComArts 101, Section 1 and Section 2 for tomorrow, April 6th and April 7th and April 8th. This is this week's unit for Com 101, both Section 1 and Section 2, okay? Please email me with questions. And for those of you in section 2 on Tuesday night, there's still a handful of you who have not sent in your test. You have to do that. Okay, thank you and stay safe.